Maseches Gittin Daf Lamed Aleph is the last daf in the third parak of the Masechta. It takes us to the end of the third parak. It begins with a Mishnah a few lines into the first Amud, and the Mishnah discusses what happens if a person is assuming that he has fruits or money around that he could use for Truma and Meiser purposes. How long can he rely on it if he finds they're not there? How long does he have to assume that they were gone already? So the Gemara will discuss the halachos in the Mishnah case by case. So let's begin. The Mishnah discusses somebody who has a pile of either fruits or possibly wine or any other thing, and he wants to use that as the truma or the meiser that he needs to take. Meaning, let's say he has some barrels of wine, then the other wine that he harvests, he wants to drink that wine, and he'll set aside that this wine that he set aside in the corner or in the shed, that is the truma, and that's what's mitake in the other wine, which he's allowed to drink. So the Mishnah says he's allowed to do that. He's allowed to assume that that wine is still there and use it for truma or for meiser. He doesn't have to check it. He's allowed to assume that it's there and that it's whole and that it's fine, and then he could assume that the truma is in that spot and the rest of it is mitukin. The same thing applies if he has money and he wants to use the money to be mechalel truma, to be mechal meiser sheni that he has. Now, what happens if he goes to check at some point and finds that they aren't there? They're gone. Now, some of the truma that he took is therefore not truma. It was taken on something which doesn't exist. How far back does he have to assume it was gone, such that the fruits that he was mitaken, that he took truma off, based on those, are not mitaken? He has to take truma on them again if they're still around. So the Mishnah quotes Rabbi Elazar, and Rabbi Elazar says 24 hours. Then it quotes Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda doesn't seem to argue. The Gemara is going to say that Rabbi Elazar is a das yachid. The other ones do argue. Rabbi Yehuda says there are 3 periods in the year in which you have to check wine to make sure it didn't turn to vinegar. And that's the same situation. You're using it as meiser, assuming that it's still wine. Once it turns to vinegar, you can only use it for meiser for other vinegar. You can't use it for meiser for wine. It has to be the same min. So the 3 times of the year are when the first one is when the east wind blows on the end of Sukkot, right after Sukkot is over. The second one is when the blossoms begin to come out on the grapevines. And the third one is when the juice or the water enters the grapes. Rashi has 2 explanations of what that means. Either when it starts to get juicy, the grapes growing in the vine start to become enlarged with juice, or that you pick off the unripe grapes and soak them in water as part of a makeshift wine making process. Okay. Let's see the Gemara. The Gemara begins. The Gemara says when Rabbi Elazar said you have to assume 24 hours, what was he referring to? The Gemara has 2 opinions. Rabbi Yechanan says he's saying for the last 24 hours previous, up till 24 hours previous from when you checked them, you found that they were gone, you have to assume that they were gone for the entire most recent period of 24 hours. So any truma that was taken during that time, you have to take again. Previous to 24 hours before you found it, you could assume that it was there. You don't have to re-meiser that. Now, Rabbi Elazar ben Antigonus says the name of Rabbi Elazar ben Bianai is not what it means. It means you can only assume that it was there for 24 hours after the last time you saw that it was there. For when you placed it down, if that was the last time, you have 24 hours going forward in time, which you could assume that it was still there. From after that, all that time until you found it missing, you have to assume that it was missing, and all that stuff has to be re-meisered. So Gemara points out, if you look at the wording of the Mishnah, it doesn't fit with the second shot. It says if he found that they were gone, he has to be concerned for 24 hours. That means for the last 24 hours, yes, it would be the period of 24 hours is the period in which he has to assume that they're gone, not the only period in which he can assume that they are there. So it's a kasha on them. It is a bit doesn't fit too well. Okay, next the Gemara quotes Rabbi Elazar. The Gemara says, do the Chachamim argue on Rabbi Elazar or not? So the Gemara quotes the Amayir Rabbi Elazar ben Pedas, and he says, yes, they argue. And you can see that from a Mishnah discussing a mikvah. If you have a mikvah which people were using, and they were using it to be matar themselves or kalim, and then they were using taharas, they were using truma, based on the assumption that it was tahar because of this mikvah, and then they measured the mikvah and it was found to be missing. It was not a full share, it wasn't a full 40 saw. So those people and the kalim that went in there are really tamei. So they were metame, the truma that they touched. So how far back do we have to assume that the mikvah was short, it was lacking, and therefore the people were tamei, and the truma has to be burned? How far back do you have to go? So the Rabbanon say limafreya, which the Gemara says means all the way back from the last time that you checked it. And this is true whether the truma was touched in Rosh Hashanah or Rosh Hashanah. Even though generally we say Safek Tumah and Rosh Hashanah is Tahar, that's only It's a suffix if it was touched or not. Here it was definitely touched, or just a suffix. If the mikvah had been chaser or mali at that time, there you don't have such a suffix. You don't have such a rule. So Gemara asks, so obviously there you see here clearly the Rabbanan argue on Rabbi Lazar. What is the Gemara's point? The Gemara says, no, you could have maybe tried to push this off and say when they say limafreya, it only means the last 24 hours, and therefore it's coming to tell me, no, limafreya means all the way back to the last time. You definitely knew that it was a full-fledged mikvah. Gemara now moves on and analyzes the next part of the Mishnah, the statement of Rabbi Yehuda about the 3 seasons of wine. Gemara will bring other types of 3 seasons, and then Gemara will get into some Magadata about the winds of the world and how they work. So Gemara quotes a brisa that says, when we said that it's the east wind of after Sukkot, that is the first time when you have to check the wine. So it's talking about only if it's after the autumnal equinox. That's if you're already in the fall, the autumn season. If you're still in the summer season, that doesn't count. If Sukkot was very early and you're still in the summer season, that does not count. Another quote, Brisa, Rav Yehuda says there are 3 times when you sell grain. One is before seeding, one is the time of seeding, and one is 15 days before Pesach. Now 3 times that you sell wine. One is 15 days before Pesach, 15 days before Shavuos, and 15 days before Sukkot. And oil from Shavuos and on. Somewhere says you can sell your wine whenever you want. What does this mean, the 3 times when you sell wine? For what halacha is that? Somewhere says that's for the halacha if you have partners and they have an argument as to when to sell. These are the times when the one who doesn't want to sell can't say it's not the time to sell. These are clearly the times to sell, and the one who wants to sell doesn't have to ask permission from his partner. Now, what about after these periods, the specific crop of wine after this time? What do you do with it then? You're not supposed to sell it anymore. The season's already over. So Rava says you can sell it at any time. Every day that happens afterwards is the right time. And then more quotes the pasuk in Sefer Yaina talking about the wind. Once we discussed the east wind, we talk about more east winds here. So it says the sun shone, and Hashem appointed a east wind that was charishis. And it caused the kikayon to die. What does charishis mean? So a few explanations. Yehuda says charishis is from the word chayrish, to plow, and charishis means it made the sea into furrows. It pushed the waves into furrows before it, just like a plowed field. And therefore it's saying that it's a strong wind. So it says Rabbah, so why are you telling me if it's a strong wind, then it cools off the world? So why does it say that the sun was so hot and it beat on Yonah's head and he felt faint? That the wind is contradicting the description of heat. So Rabbah says, so charishus means something else. It's from the word meaning quiet. And this wind, when it blows, it quiets all the other winds. The other winds have a cooling effect. This wind has a heating effect. And it overpowers the cooling effect of all the other winds of the world. And that's, he quotes a pasuk to support that. In Erev it says, you end up getting heated up when the wind quiets things down from the south. The southern wind heats everything up and it quiets all the other cooling winds. Okay, so says the Gemara, says of Tachlifa bar Rav Chizda, in the name of Rav Chizda, when does one's clothing become worn? At the time that the southern wind blows, because it quiets all the other winds. That's what we see here from the pasuk. Now, Rav Huna and Rav Chizda, the Marcos incident, they were sitting together, and Geniva came to them. Now, Geniva, we saw earlier, was a Talmid Chacham, but he was not a good person. He had been Mitzayir Mar Ukva, we saw very much on Daf Zayin. So Gemara says, so they saw Geniva was coming, and one, Rav Huna and Rav Chizda, one said to the other, let's stand up for him because he knows halacha. So he said, why should we stand in front of him? He's a fighter. He starts up with people. Anyway, while they were having this discussion, he came upon them. So he said to them, what are you learning? So they said, we're discussing the winds. So he said to them, this is what Rav Hanan by Rava said, the name of Rav. There are 4 winds of the world that blow every day, and the north wind blows with all of them. If not for the north wind blowing with all of them, it would destroy the world. The south wind, he said, is the worst of them all. It's the hottest, and its heat is enough to destroy the world. And if not for a malach called Ben Nates, son of a hawk, because he had wings like a hawk, if not for him stopping it, it would destroy the world. But he stops it, like the pasuk says, "Hamevinascha ye'aver Nates yifros knafav l'teman." He spreads his wings over this south. The Gemara now quotes another incident. The Gemara says that Rav and Rav Yitzchak were sitting together, and Rav Nachman Bar Yaakov was passing. He traveled in a golden carriage covered with a cloak of tcheles. It looked very fancy. Those two Chachamim, Rav and Rav Yitzchak, couldn't tell who he was. It looked like he was someone who was close to the Reish Galusa, close to the leader, the ruler. And Rava went to greet him without knowing who it was, and Menachem Yitzchak did not. Now, Rava went to greet him because Rava needed to be in the favorable side of the Reish Galusa. Menachem Yitzchak was close to the Nasi, as we've seen in other Masechtas, and therefore he didn't need anything from the Reish Galusa, so he didn't go. And when it drew closer, so was Menachem Bar Yaakov, it was not from the Reish Galusa, it was the Talmid Chacham. So Menachem Yitzchak went up to him as well. So when they arrived, he rolled up his sleeves. He said, "The wind is blowing, it's very hot." So Rav said, this is what Rav said, "This wind is so hot it can even make a woman miscarry." Shmuel said it can even make a pearl in the sea rot. And Yochanan said even the zera that's within a woman's innards, which usually is fresh for 3 days, spoils because of this zera. Says Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, and they all learn, each of these 3 things are learned out of a pasuk in Hosea. It says, "Ki hu ben achim yafri yavei kodem ruach Hashemi midbar oila v'yevoish." The east wind comes from Hashem from the desert and it dries. What does it dry? So it says v'yevoish mikoiroi, it dries the fountain. Yecharav miyanai, it'll destroy the spring. Uyista oitzer kol klichemda, it'll turn aside the storehouses of all good things. So what are these 3 things referring to? So the Gemara says Mikori refers to the womb of the woman that's carrying the child. That's to say that she miscarries. Yecher Mayane refers to the zera, that gets destroyed in the woman's intestines. And Eiskol Klichemda, that refers to the things which are hidden, stored, the treasure. That's the pearls in the sea, and that's what each of these 3 Chachamim were referring to. They were deriving it from this pasuk here specifically. Said Rav, this is all a drasha of the people of Surah. They're the ones who have this, because it says, Kihu bein achim yafri. So what does Kihu bein achim yafri mean? It's the first part of the pasuk. So the Gemara says, Yafri, it means a shufsa kupina demara, a handle in a hoe becomes loose because of the wind. It dries it up so much that it contracts and becomes loose. Rav Yosef said, even a pin stuck in the wall becomes loose. And Rav Acha Bar Yaakov said even a reed that's woven into a mat dries and becomes loose. This is the end of the daf and the end of the 3rd parak of the Masechta.